Module 11, Developing Use Cases from Ideas to Services. Lecture 3, MVP for Blockchain Use Cases. In this lecture, we will cover the concept of MVP, user stories, and prioritization. This module is about developing use cases from ideas to services, and it's about design heuristics for reaching customer needs, managing products, and creating services using the blockchain-based application. In terms of knowledge, this lecture is about product development principles applied to blockchain contexts, and the skills concern collecting and prioritizing requirements for defining an MVP, that is minimum viable product, for blockchain use cases. In regards to responsibility and autonomy, this lecture is about being capable to explain potential product or services customer, including their goals, challenges, and aspirations. Cooperate within diverse teams to achieve goals of blockchain use case. Share and communicate knowledge about customers' need, product specifics, process heuristics among the use case team members. The learning objective of this particular lecture is first to understand the concept of MVP when developing a blockchain use case. Secondly, to understand how requirements for a blockchain use case can be developed. And finally, understand how requirements can be prioritized to define what constitutes as a blockchain use case MVP. Let us begin by considering the value of MVP. How can we reduce the risk of wasting time and money with new products? If we are beginning with a new use case powered by blockchain technology, how do we reduce the time and money in order to develop this use case? What we want to avoid is to invest a lot of time and money in developing a blockchain use case that, when ready and launched, fails completely. And the failure is because we built a use case and implemented a spectacular solution that nobody in the market saw a need for, that nobody in the market is willing to pay for, or that not enough people in the market are willing to pay for. The answer is MVP. How can we reduce risk and wasting time and money with a new blockchain use case? The answer is MVP. How is that possible? Well, the MVP is defined as a version of a new product, in this case, blockchain use case, which allows a team, meaning those who are working with the blockchain use case, to collect as much information they can from customers, from real customers, with as little effort as possible. Flipping it, its MVP is a way by which we can spend as little effort as possible to gain as much valuable and validated data from our customers. The reason being that if I can do this, early on, I can see if my blockchain use case could fly or not, without spending too much time on the project. So an MVP is a version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. Therefore, the definition of an MVP means that a working product with just enough features to assess if there is a product market fit and to provide feedback for future product development. That means that an MVP is the bare minimum features required for the blockchain use case to work. It needs to work. The minimum features required is defined by the absolute necessary features I have to have in place for this product to work. But just to work, not for it to be feasible to use, not for it to be good looking, fully supported, completely bug-free, really stable and reliable. No, just for it to have enough features, the minimum number of features required to make it work, that somebody can actually use it and achieve the objective they wanted to achieve. And I want to have this MVP for two purposes. One is to get an understanding of the product market fit. The product market fit is about how well this blockchain use case fits with what the market needs. If we develop a wonderful blockchain use case that is not needed or desired or wanted by anybody in the market, it will simply not be used. Not being used means that no revenues are generated, and no revenues being generated means that the blockchain use case will go bankrupt. So how do I figure out if there is a need in the market for my blockchain use case? Well, one way is to produce a working version that is bare minimum and then actually test it to see if customers use it or not. In this way, I have spent as little effort as possible to get a working MVP, and I learn if customers need it or not, if they like it or not, if they want it or not. If it turns out that they don't want it, I have only wasted the little effort I put in. If it turns out that they like it, we come to the second benefit of MVP. That is that they will provide feedback to me that is going to be very valuable in how I further develop this product. This is particularly important for the product development. I can develop a product on my own, based on my own assumptions and on what I think is relevant, what I think the customers want. However, more often than not, I am wrong. More often than not, my assumptions are not rooted in data. To reduce that risk, I want to gather as much validated data as possible. The data I get from customers who use the product, the feedback they provide me is far more valuable than what I could come to think of my own. Because in this way, the next steps of the product evolution is based on customers who are going to buy this product, my real future customers. That's why we work with an MVP. Now, when working with an MVP, the idea is that from the initial point, it works. So in this case, the first version is a skateboard. Now the skateboard works. I can transport myself from point A to point B with a skateboard. It's not fast. It's not the safest. It's not the most comfortable way, but I can transport myself from point A to point B. Then I add, once I get the confirmation that customers are willing to use it, and I get the feedback saying that it's not comfortable, it would be easier if there is a handle, I can add the handle to it, and it still works, but it's a bit better. And gradually, I evolve the product, or in this case, the blockchain use case, from the MVP to a fully fledged product that is ready, mature, feasible, easy to use, and valued by customers. So the end product here is the car. Now, if I would have developed the car by first creating the chassis, and then creating the doors, and then creating mounting the tires, and then putting in the seats, and finally putting in the engine, I would not have delivered any value to the customer until the very end, until the car was finished. And if the customers don't want the car, I just wasted a lot of time and money on producing a full car that is not interested, that is not used, that nobody wants. That is a waste of money and time. However, adopting the MVP approach and in an agile, iterative way, at each step, I am delivering value to the customer, meaning that they can use it to achieve their objective. But gradually, I'm improving it to become more valuable for the customer. Therefore, the MVP, the concept of the MVP, is that I have the minimum functionalities required to work. I have the absolute minimum requirement. Every feature in the MVP is absolutely necessary for it to work. If I take away a single feature from that version, it won't work. Meaning that it cannot do what the customer wants. If I take away the wheels from the skateboard, it cannot take the customer forward. If I take away the board, it cannot help the customer. So in that regard, these two things are the minimum viable, are the minimum functionalities, components required. And because because I have the minimum features or the functionalities, I also spend the minimum amount of effort as compared to working on a full version. And that means that the implementation is also going to be much faster because I am only spending the minimum implementation. Therefore, when we work with blockchain use cases, we want to target what is the minimum viable product, the MVP for that use case, so to quickly bring it to the market and gain very valuable input from users and see if there is a product market fit. So MVP serves the purpose of allowing quick deployment of the product or the blockchain use case in this way, to create a viable product for the customer. A use case, a blockchain use case that actually delivers value. We do this to test the fundamental business hypothesis we have, because we apply a blockchain use case with the assumption that, with the hypothesis that this will deliver value and the customers are want to do it in this way because it's far better. Now, that is a hypothesis, that is an assumption. With an MVP, we test it to see if we were right or wrong, or most commonly, we were slightly right. And that allows us to test this hypothesis, the product in the market, and that helps us gather valuable, validated customer feedback that informs us of how well it complies with the needs of the market and where we take the product next. But in order to develop the MVP, we need to have a set of requirements. A requirement is a representation. It is a way of capturing a customer's need. And we want to do this based on an understanding of what real value the need can bring to the customer. It is, in other words, if you want to make it a bit more simple, a requirement is basically what the information system needs to do. A requirement in this context is what does the blockchain use case need to do in order to deliver value for the customer. Anything that does not deliver value to the customer or enables delivery of value to the customer, we want to avoid. But a requirement is nothing more than just a way of expressing, capturing, documenting something that the blockchain use case needs to do that has value for the customer. There are many ways by which requirements can be documented. One way of doing it, which is particularly helpful for agile ways of developing, is what they call user stories. A user story has the benefit of being oriented towards the end user. And as we said, the requirement is what a blockchain use case has to do in order to deliver value for a customer. Extend that to anything that has the value for an end user, for somebody that uses the blockchain use case. So with a user story, we take that perspective of the person or the entity that is going to use the blockchain use case. User stories are commonly built upon 3 C's, they say: card, conversation, confirmation. What that means is that you usually have 1 card per user story. This card captures the text, the requirement, the customer need, or the user need, what the blockchain use case has to deliver on that card. And you can annotate it with some additional information, such as the effort required to deliver this or some other comments. But the idea is that 1 requirement, that is 1 user story on 1 card. Naturally, there are digital versions, so it doesn't have to be a physical card. But regardless, that's the concept. The second C stands for conversation. The idea is that the user story is developed through conversation. This stands as a contrast to how requirements were developed decades ago, when 1 person wrote them down and handed them over to the IT department, and the IT department had to figure out what that meant and then start coding to deliver that functionality or feature. Rather now, the concept in the user story is that we have a conversation about this requirement. We together discuss, converse to find what is the user story, and the conversation takes place between the business analyst, the process analyst, the blockchain analyst, or the IT developers, or whoever that is involved in this team. And the third part, the third C of a user story, is confirmation. And confirmation is about how do I know that this user story, this requirement, has been fulfilled? How can I see? How can I measure? How can I assess that this requirement, this user story, has now been completed, is now okay? And that is what we do with acceptance criteria. So the user story follows a template that puts the user at the center. A user story is short, simple description of a feature told from the perspective of the person who desires, who needs, who wants the new capability. That usually is a customer or an end user internal to the company or the system. Now, the template for a user story is very straightforward. It begins with as a, and then you put the type of user, such as a customer, as a admin, as a sales executive, as a CEO, as a supplier, as a collaborator, whatever it might be. But we take the user perspective here and set as a user, I want. And when we define the goal, what it is that they're trying to do, what is it that they want to do, and we finally put so that. And when we provide the reason, the motivation, the rationale for why the goal or the achievement or the thing that they want to do is relevant for the user. Because it begins as a, we have the focus now on the user. So let's take an example. As a, and then we put the persona, I want to achieve something so that, and that's the rationale. The persona here, as the user, that's where we describe who we are building this functionality for. This is the part where the user is defined. Who is the consumer of this particular, who is the user of this particular feature? I want to, here we describe the intention. We don't describe the features that the users have. We are describing what they're trying to do, what they want to do. And finally, we put the so that basically provides a reason for the benefit, the value, the reasoning, the why they need this or want this specific feature. So let's take a concrete example. This is a user story stating that as a frequent flyer, the user here is the frequent flyer. The one that we are building this feature for is the frequent flyer. I want to, okay, what is it that they want to be able to do? It is not a feature of the system. It's taking the perspective of the frequent flyer, the user, and states what they want to do. They want to rebook a past trip. That's what they want to do. See, note that it's not the feature described here. It's taking the position of the user and what they want to do. I want to rebook a past trip so that I save time booking trips I take often. This is the value. This is the why they want that frequent, that rebooking of past trips. I've said this a couple of times, but it bears another mentioning. I want to is not the feature. I don't say, as a frequent flyer, I want to A, search my flight. B, select my flight. C, choose the dates. D, check out. That's the features. That's not what we say here. Here we say, I want to rebook a past trip. That's what I want to do. Now, we talked about the confirmation. How do I know that this user story is delivered? How do I know that this is now covered? That's where the acceptance criteria, the confirmation comes in. So at the back of this card, you can write what is needed. Well, if I can find the past trip, that's 1. 2, I can choose it. 3, I can modify the dates. And 4, book it. Then I have achieved this user story. Which means that when is this user story done? When can I, as a frequent flyer, rebook a past trip so that I save time? Well, it's when I can see my past trips, select one route, change the dates, and book. These 4 things become the acceptance criteria, the confirmation, which you write at the back end of it. What that means is that when the development team has delivered those 4 things, then it's done. Which means that when you want to test this user story, you check those things. That's your checklist for testing. Can I find the past flight? Yes, I can. Good. Can I select it? Yes, I can. Good. Can I change the dates? Yes, I can. Can I book it? Yes, I can. Then it's done. But if it can't do any of those things, then it's not done. So that is about the requirements. The first one is that we have a template as I want to, so that. We focus on the user, what they're trying to achieve or what they want to do, and the motivation explaining why this is valuable to them. We do this in conversation with the team. So it's not an individual task that somebody sits and writes a lot of them. We discuss them each. On the back side of the card, we write down what needs to be developed, what are the features required for us to consider this user story as completed. In our case, it was to find, select, change dates, and book. Now we have different requirements. And we have far more requirements than we can include in the MVP. What do? We need to bring all those requirements down to those that are absolutely necessary for the MVP. We need to select the requirements. We need to choose which user stories we are going to include for the MVP. In other words, we need to figure out which of the user stories are absolutely necessary to have for our blockchain use case to deliver minimum features, minimum solution, the minimum viable product to work. Minimum meaning least amount of things. Viable meaning that it actually can deliver a value, that it actually works. The value doesn't have to be big. It's actually going to be very little, but it is nevertheless a value. How do we do this? Well, we use prioritization methods. There are different ways by which we can prioritize. One is, for example, RICE, which stands for Reach, Impact, Cost, Effort. Reach, Impact, Confidence, Effort. The idea with the RICE is that we look at a specific feature and we consider what is the reach, how many will this reach? We look at the impact, how much will this impact be? We look at the confidence, meaning how confident are we on these numbers? And then we divide it by effort. This is a good method once you have your MVP in place and you have a set of features that you want to prioritize in regards to which one should I do next. In that case, it's good to see if I choose the feature, I prioritize based on how many will be reached by this change, what is the impact, how confident I am on these numbers, and then divided by effort. Another way is Kano, which looks at which features are necessary, which features are desired, and which features will just excite the customer. And there is a whole methodology on how to determine those. You also have a lean method, but what we want to do now, and while these methods work well for once you have the MVP in place and the question is how do I evolve the product or the blockchain use case, what we want to do is to reduce the number of use cases to the absolute minimum. In that context, Moscow is a very simple yet efficient tool or method of prioritization. Moscow stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have. The idea is that I begin with the user stories, the list of user stories I have. Let us assume that I have a list of 25 user stories. Then I sit. For each one of the user stories, I assess, is this user story a must-have? Is it a should have, could have, or won't have? Now, a must-have user story, or prioritized as a must-have, it must be included before I can launch the product. Meaning that if I don't have this user story included, the product won't work. It simply won't work. Should have, on the other hand, concerns user stories that are not critical, but they're very important. Which means that I can use the product if I don't have this user story implemented, but if I have it, it's so much better. Could have are features or user stories that I can add later because they are valuable, but comparatively not right now. And won't have are user stories that in some way or another does simply not deliver enough value, and it will not be included in the near future. Oftentimes, considering the backlog, they are commonly not implemented at all. As you can see here, the must-haves constitute the MVP. The reason is the criteria for must-have is that I have to have it, otherwise it won't work. And the MVP is about having the absolute minimum for it to work, for it to actually deliver a value to the customers, that they can actually achieve their objective, even if it is very complicated or difficult or bad UX or whatever. However, the should have should not be included because I can use the product without the should have prioritized user stories. I should not be tempted to add one or two of them in the MVP. Why? Because MVP is about the minimum effort required to gain valuable data. And if I add a should, it's no longer the minimum. It means that if it turns out that the MVP didn't work, we did not get the product market fit, then I wasted my time and effort on anything related to the should have user stories. First, we want to make sure that people want this product, that this blockchain use case is valuable for somebody. Then we go into adding features. The other problem of including a should have requirement is that I assess it to be should have, but maybe the users don't. Maybe the users found a couple of things that we classified as could have, and they want that rather than the ones we classified as should have. So for these two reasons, we keep to must have. A must have is not a subjective thing. It is simply the user stories that has to be in place for it to work. You can test that. You take away one of the must-haves, will it work? If the answer is yes, it will work, it was not a must-have prioritization, it was a should-have. But if you take away a must-have and it doesn't work, it falls apart. It just doesn't deliver the value. The customer cannot do anything that delivers, that helps them to achieve their objective, then it is a must-have. Commonly, when somebody says that I have now the bare minimum of my blockchain use case, commonly one or two could still be removed and it would still work. With this in mind, what we do is that we gather now the requirements, the user stories, that we have defined as must-have, the ones that are absolutely critical for the product to work. We've done that through the prioritization, so we have the user stories, we prioritized, so we filtered out anything else but the must-haves. Now we develop the details of this user story. Now we develop the acceptance criteria. Why didn't we do that earlier? Because if I spent extra time defining the details of a user story that later was prioritized as wouldn't have, or should have, or could have, I wasted time and effort. So I only want to spend time on the user stories that I know will be implemented. And the user stories that I know will be implemented are the ones that are must-have, because without them, the product will not work. So let's take an example of the KYC for banks that we discussed previously. One user story is, as a customer, I want to share my data with banks so that I don't have to upload the same information multiple times. This is very clear. As a customer, I want to share my data with the banks so that I don't have to upload the same information multiple times. We see the user here, we see what they want to achieve, and then we see that the reasoning, how it delivers value for them. Now, on back of this card, we could define the acceptance criteria, such as I can select a bank, I can approve, I can say okay to sharing the data, I can maybe revoke the access right. Now, here you can go a bit more into different details depending on what kind of solution it is. For an MVP, I would not recommend this, but you could also be that as a customer, I get a notification that a bank requests my data and I approve or I disapprove. But this would be the acceptance criteria, meaning that if these things are in place, then it's done. One common mistake is that when writing user stories is that just focusing on the customer. But there is another aspect of it. For a blockchain use case, we have multiple parties. And multiple parties mean that we have multiple users that also want to engage somehow with the process. So here, another user story is as a bank. As a bank, I want to access customer data so that I can onboard a customer faster. Now this user story is about the perspective of the bank, equally important. If you only have the user story for the customer, then the customer can grant access to the bank. But the solution won't work because the bank cannot get access to the customer data. So for a blockchain use case, the MVP is a bit bigger than a traditional product because we have multiple parties we need to consider here. Another example here for this one is that as a customer, I want to restrict data access so that I can choose who gets to see my data. This is another user story following the same template. As a, and then they have the user, what do they want to achieve? You see, it doesn't state how they restrict the data. It doesn't say the steps they need to do in order to restrict the data. It doesn't talk anything about which banks they can choose from and so on. It doesn't say that they can restrict data access to multiple banks at the same time, nothing like that. It just says that they want to restrict data access. And the reason is because they want to choose who gets their data. They want to choose who gets access to it. The things I mentioned about how, that is in the acceptance criteria. That it could be that the customer select bank or select multiple banks. These are all the details that when they are implemented, you define. Do you define the details? So when they are implemented, that means that the user story is ready. So now we have a set of user stories. What we want to do here is to prioritize them. And we want to prioritize them based on, for instance, the Moscow method. Identifying which ones are must-have, which ones are should-have, could have, and won't have. And once I've done that, I can start building or framing my MVP. And as we said, the must-have requirements are the ones that will go and become the MVP of my blockchain use case. Therefore, in summary, by first taking the approach of implementing the least necessary for my blockchain use case to work, I save time and effort. I also gain very quickly, very early in the product development or the use case development, validated, valuable data on how the customers welcome the blockchain use case. I do so by first capturing the requirements of my blockchain use case, then prioritizing them and only including the absolute must-have requirements in the MVP. And the absolute must-have requirements are those that if I remove a single one of them, the customer will not be able to conduct and get value from my blockchain use case. If I remove it and the customer can still get value, it was not an absolute necessary requirement. In this way, we come to our MVP. And from here, we get a validation from the customers that this idea will float, and we get information as to how to evolve this product over the next period of time.